Good evening. Welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study. Go ahead and grab your Bibles. Turn to Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4 is where we will be tonight. I have a lot to cover. Should be a good time of study. For those watching this on the day it's posted, this Wednesday, just a quick announcement. We will be starting a form of our Sunday morning services back this coming Sunday, which I believe will be May 10th. I've totally lost track of days just like everybody else. Just so you know, there will be some differences this Sunday. One, there will be limited seating to abide by all the rules that we're being given to try to keep people safe. We'll only be using every other pew, and then 2 family units on the same pew will have to keep at least 6 feet between each other. Now, what will happen is if we overflow our auditorium, we're also going to make space in the back where those in the back can sit, still social distancing, and watch the live stream from back there. We are encouraging all of our members who are at risk, which would be those 65 and over, those with other health problems, to go ahead, stay home, stay safe, follow along with the live stream. We will continue to do that for, well, hopefully from now on, actually. So please plan on doing that. Parents, if you have children, we are going to ask that you keep your children with you the whole time you're here. Please don't let them run around unattended. It's very hard for a child to understand social distancing. Let's be honest, it's hard for some of our adults to understand social distancing, so I really don't expect our children to. So keep them with you. There will be no Bible classes for now. There will only be the normal worship part of our service. So that's what's going to start this Sunday. Again, we will still be live streaming, so if you are uncomfortable, if you're still nervous, or you just still think the best thing to do is to stay home, isolate, and watch from there, please do that. We're perfectly okay with that. We're trying to serve as many as possible. So that's coming up this Sunday, May 10th. Check your emails, your texts. If you're a member here, you should be getting information on that. All right, well, that's enough of that. Let's get to our Bible study. In Ephesians chapter 4, I'm going to start by reading the first 6 verses. So Ephesians chapter 4, starting at verse 1. As a prisoner of the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, through all, and in all. All right, we are getting into the meat of Ephesians finally. And this part of Ephesians chapter 4 really lays the foundation for everything that's going to follow it. Now, he starts out there in verse 1 saying, live a life worthy of what you've been called to. And that raises the question, what is a worthy life? Now, different people at different times from different cultures, different perspectives, will give a different answer for that. A worthy life may be a life of wealth, a life of comfort, a life of ease, a life of hard work. Just sort of depends on where you're coming from. But from a Christian perspective, there is a definite set of qualities that play into this worthy life. Look back at it again. He says, if you live a life worthy of your calling, then he tells us what that is basically. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Now, this is going to be a little different than what most of us were expecting, but a worthy life starts with humility. And I think there's a reason Paul, through the Spirit, this is the Spirit of God speaking to us through Paul, actually. There's a reason the Spirit says this to us. Humility is one of the things we struggle with most, and our lack of humility is what's going to make the next part so much harder. So let me pause for a second. What is humility? Well, humility is not taking credit, right? That's the athlete that scored 300 points in a basketball game, and they're interviewing him afterwards and goes, well, what was the key to your success in this game? Well, it was a team effort. Even though nobody else scored, nobody else rebounded, nobody else touched the ball, but it was a team effort. Is that humility? Not really. Humility is actually not thinking more of yourself than you should. It's not just the lip service. Too often in our society, we've relegated humility to lip service. As long as I give other people credit or I don't brag, then I'm humble. No, humility is a much deeper concept than that. To truly be humble, the kind of humble that God is calling us to be here, is to truly see others as equal to or even more important than ourselves. True humility is understanding that I'm not special. Now, that sounds terrible, doesn't it? Because we spend all of our time telling each other, oh, you're special, and I'm special, and everybody's special. I can't even remember the movie right now, but I remember one kid, it was The Incredibles. That's what it was. Where one of the parents say to the son, well, everybody's special. And he responds, that's just a way of saying nobody is. And humility actually accepts that. Yes, we are special in some ways, but when we look at each other, we can't see ourselves as being more special than the people around us. Our lack of humility is what causes so many of the problems we face. And if we're going to live a life worthy of our King, worthy of Jesus, then it's going to have to start with humility. And notice the last thing it says, it ends with love. Because that's how humility is ultimately expressed. It's expressed in how we love one another. But he says it's humility, it's gentleness, patience, bearing with one another. We'll look at all these, but let's look at bearing with one another for a second. I know I'm hopping around here a little bit. But how do you bear with somebody? The idea of bearing with somebody means sticking with them even when things aren't going well. Even when they're being annoying, even when you don't agree with them, even when there's conflict in the relationship, we bear with one another when we're willing to carry each other's burdens. And I'm not going to do that if I'm not humble. I'm going to have trouble showing gentleness to somebody who's struggling or somebody that I disagree with if I haven't cultivated humility in my life. And humility takes effort. Everything in our culture tells us to take care of number one, to have the attitude that I'm the most important person in the room, that I'm the pinnacle of whatever. That's not how God works. Christianity says, no, I'm going to be the servant of all. The King of Kings, the person who was, is, always will be everything, the top, nobody above him ever, talking about Jesus. He humbled himself and came to earth, born to peasants, born into poverty, lived his life really as a nobody, as far as his status, his wealth, his position was concerned. Even when he taught and he preached, he never really forced himself on anybody. When he hung on the cross, the ultimate act of submission and humility, what did he say to his Father? He said, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. The very people who had nailed him to that tree. You see, if we're going to live a life worthy of that King, of Jesus, we have to imitate those qualities. And it will begin with humility, because humility is the hardest to cultivate. And when I stop thinking more of myself, thinking that I've got all the answers, I'm the standard by which everybody else should be judged. And let's be honest, that's how most of us feel. When we look in the mirror, we see more perfection than we should. So we have to have gentleness. We have to be patient. We have to bear with one another. And then in doing that, we get to this next part. Let's look at that again, starting in verse 3. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body, one Spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, through all, and in all. All right, the great unity passage. I want to throw you a curveball here. I'm just going to suggest from the beginning that this doesn't mean what most of us probably have spent most of our lives thinking it means. Too often we look at this passage, the ones, the 7 ones that are listed here, and we say, okay, there's only one of all these things, so anybody who doesn't conform to my perception of what each of these things are, well, then they're not really part of us, right? In Christianity, there's a lot of division. It's sad because this whole thing is a plea for unity, but in Christianity as a whole, there is all kinds of division. I couldn't even begin to guess at how many denominations are out there now, how many different versions of Christianity there are. And even within these, the big denominations that we think of, you know, the bigger titles, within each of those there's splits. Within Churches of Christ, there's multiple different versions that practice their faith in slightly different ways. They wear the same name, but they're not the same. And they don't cooperate with each other. And then you start adding the other denominations to that, and Christianity becomes, well, a fractured mess. And part of it is because we misunderstand this passage. When I look, I'm giving you my perspective here, so don't take it for any more than that. But when I look at this passage, the plea for unity isn't everybody's going to have to do everything the exact same way. In the history of Christianity, that lasted about 3 weeks, if that. The first major council we see in Christianity early in the book of Acts was when some people were being neglected, some people weren't, and it was a racial thing that was going on, and the apostles and the elders and the leaders had to step in and say, hey, we got to figure this out. The next council was, okay, we've got Gentiles doing this or doing that, and they don't look like us, and what are we going to do? In Christianity, there have always been different approaches, all right? Always. What Paul is saying here isn't everybody has to do things the exact same way, because in Paul's day they weren't. The Christians in Jerusalem were not necessarily worshiping exactly like the Christians in Antioch. The Christians in Jerusalem, when you look at the book of Acts, they retain much more of their Jewish culture in their worship, and that was fine. The apostles didn't berate them for that. But they did say the Gentiles did not have to do that. So if this list of ones isn't a declaration that every Christian must do things exactly the same way, what is it? Well, maybe, just maybe, it's an admonition to see things from God's perspective. That ultimately, regardless of our differences, there is one God. There is one King. There is one faith, that is Christianity. There is one baptism, one death. That's what baptism represents. One entrance into this kingdom. But that's from God's perspective, not necessarily from ours. You see, the problem is if we try to take that and say, okay, everybody has to do it the same, whose standard are we going to use? Well, inevitably, mine. Right? The person who thinks we're doing it wrong will demand we do it their way. That's where the majority of conflict in the church comes. We reach a conclusion we believe to be true, and we therefore demand everybody else conform to my conclusion. But is that humility? Is that gentleness? Is that love? And really the big one is that humility. Because once I decide to enforce my perceptions on others and demand to not view them even as Christian unless they conform to what I believe they should be, well, then I put myself in God's place. Instead of being humble, I've elevated myself to the throne of God and decided that I will pronounce judgment. And that's a very dangerous thing to do. See, humility has to be patient. Now, why do I do the things I do? Why am I a member of the church I'm a member of? Why do I preach what I preach? Because that is what I believe to be true. And I believe there is truth. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying everything is relative. What I'm saying is my ability and your ability to perceive this ultimate reality is limited. Yeah, a lot of times in my life, and rightly so, I've had people say to me in one way or another, you're not as smart as you think you are. And you know what? They're right. I'm not. I mean, I have lots of answers in my head that I truly believe this has to be it. I can line it up logically. I can argue it. Those who know me know I like to argue. I'm actually pretty good at arguing. I don't think that's a bragging point, by the way. But I'm not the standard. I'm not the head. I'm not the king. All I can do is my best to conform to God's image. So I will try my best to find the one body, the one baptism, the one king, the one faith, but realize what defines those is not me. And technically, it's not even the Bible. It's God. Now, God, through Scripture, leads us towards those things. He reveals those things as best as we can understand them, but it is God Himself who defines what these things are. And it's our job to humbly submit. But we do it how? With gentleness, with bearing one another. To the idea of keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Unity will never be achieved by everybody believing the same thing. It's been tried many, many times. The problem is we can never get there. Unity of the Spirit becomes a unity of these characteristics. When we can all be humble with each other. When we can all be gentle with each other. When we can all be patient and bearing with each other in our divisions and in our understandings, then the unity of the Spirit becomes a real thing. Too often, we play it more like a game. Who's going to win? Who's right? I'm going to tell you there's only one winner to that game. God. Everybody else is wrong. We all try. We all have to do the best we can. I'm not saying nothing matters. God will hold you accountable to your decisions, and your conscience helps you in that. If you violate your conscience, whether it's right or wrong, you sin. Paul tells us that other places. You have to do the best you can do, and you know that you will answer to God for what you do. You don't answer for what somebody else does. So you have to believe there is absolute truth. There is one God, one faith, one baptism, one body, all of that. But when you look at the person next to you, you have to be humble and gentle and patient. And that tends to be where we fall down. Now he goes farther to help us understand. Look down to verse 8, I believe it is, or 7. Let's look at verse 7. But to each one of us grace has been given as Christ appointed it. That is why it says, when he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people. What does he ascended mean, except he also descended to the lower earthly regions? He who descended is the very one who ascended higher than all the heavens in order to fill the whole universe. Two parts out of this I want us to see, and then we'll wrap this part up this week. First, notice it says, to each one of us grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. The beauty of Christianity is it's not a system. Let me explain that. You do not find your place in God's kingdom. You do not find your salvation by conforming to a particular system, and your salvation does not depend on how well you conform to that particular system. Christianity is a relationship. It is a relationship between creation and creator. It is a relationship between subject and king. It is a relationship between brother and sister and brother and father. So, because it is personal, not corporate necessarily, don't get me wrong, there are corporate aspects to Christianity. The church is a very important part of our faith. That's why it's listed in the 7 ones. There is one body, yes. But our ultimate salvation, that's between us and our Father. The body is there to help us in that. The body is there to give us opportunities to grow in our salvation by serving those around us. but it's a personal thing. And because it's a personal thing, that's why Paul can say, our King gave us grace each individually, especially for each one of us. And that's good, because I need different grace than you necessarily need. My failures may be different than your failures. My confusion may be different than your confusion. The reality is we all have it. There is nobody, not a person in this world who has every answer. There's plenty who think they do, but they're lying. They don't. That's when arrogance runs away with us, and we really, truly, actually, one way to think of it is the oldest sin in the world. What's the original sin? Eating an apple, right? Or pear, whatever fruit you want to call it. No, the original sin is idolatry. It was thinking we could be a God, worshiping ourselves rather than our Creator. And one of the worst forms of idolatry today is when we look at ourselves and we think we are the perfect representation of our God. We were created in God's image, but the reality is a lot of us recreate God in our flawed image. When we look in the mirror, some of us think we're looking at God, and we're not. All right? I don't care how smart I am. I don't care how much I know, how much I've studied, how much I can reason, how good I can argue. I'm still flawed, and my understanding is still far from perfect. Now, I can know the truth, and the truth will set me free, but Jesus told us what that truth was. He said, He is the truth, the life, and the way. And I can know Jesus. May not know every other answer, but I do know that one. And I know who He is. You want to know the real difference between a believer and an unbeliever? A believer knows who Jesus is. The Son of God, God in the flesh, come to earth, died for us, resurrected, calls us to be His children and to allow Him to be our King. And a true believer is the one who submits to all that. Now, we're going to disagree on how to do it sometimes. That's the challenge. Because ultimately, humility is where we're going to fail. So humility needs to be the place we put a whole lot of effort. Also notice, last thing in this passage, it says that, He can give grace to each one of us as He's apportioned it, or He does it individually for each one of us. Notice it says that He ascended to heaven so that He could fill everything. You want to know what true unity is? Let Jesus be everything. Don't let yourself be anything. Whenever you start saying, well, I, me, this is my, you missed it. It's all about Him, not about me. So, what's the challenge for this week? The challenge for this week will be, check your arrogance. Take a self-evaluation. How often do you put yourself above others? Not just in matters of service, but in matters of pride and ego, in matters of understanding. Do you take what you believe and just assume anybody else who doesn't believe the same thing as you is either dishonest or ignorant? Sometimes we do. That's not a worthy life. That's not the life we're called to live. We're called to live the life of humility, gentleness, bearing with one another, and love. And this is a challenge. It's a challenge that, I don't know, I'm 48 years in and I'm still struggling with it. And I think almost all of us are. Actually, I think all of us are. This is where the challenge gets real. So look for that humility this week. Look for ways to be at peace with those around you, to preserve unity where you can, to realize it's not about you, it's about God. Embrace your own flaws. Admit you have them. Over in 1 John, John tells us point blank, he who says he has no sin is a liar and the truth isn't in him. He was writing to Christians. And that's not one sin 10 years ago. That's the struggle we have day to day. Now, because we're Christians, we don't live in that sin. That sin doesn't have to dominate us, but in humility, we have to still admit we're struggling. And if we ever become so arrogant or prideful that we want to pretend we're not struggling anymore, well, then we just lost the unity and we may lose our place. But that's for God to decide. All right. This was a deep one, a heavy one. Well, I'll let you decide if it's deep or not. That's sort of arrogant on my part to think it's deep. It was definitely heavy for me, so I hope you got something out of it. We will be doing this on Wednesday nights for the next several weeks still, so tune in next Wednesday. Until then, please stay safe, be well. We love you and look forward to seeing you again.